All right, I think we are assembled, so let's go ahead and begin. Welcome everybody to tonight's event, Delightful Discord, Arguing the Torah. If you're not here to argue about Torah, please go ahead and find a different Zoom room. This conversation is part of an ongoing series of book folios that is sponsored by the New York Jewish Week and the UJA-Federation of New York. Tonight, I have the privilege of being your host. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. I'm the editor of My Jewish Learning, which is a sister site to the New York Jewish Week. Every month, as part of this series, we have the privilege of speaking with an author about their most recent work. And this month, we are delighted to have not one, but two authors with us. So please join me in welcoming them by giving a little wave from your screen, if we can do that. We might not actually be on screen. We might not be. Okay, so we will know you are waving even if we can't see it. And so tonight we are joined by Abigail Pogrebin. Would you give a wave for us? Not that there's so many people or it's so confusing. Abigail Pogrebin is a journalist and an author. Her most notable works are My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and The Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talk About Being Jewish. She's written for The Atlantic, The Forward, and Tablet, and moderates public conversations for the Stryker Center and the Jewish Broadcasting Service. And her co-author is with us as well. Rabbi Dov Linzer, would you give a wave?
Hi.
Rabbi Linzer is president and Rosh HaYeshiva, meaning the Rabbinic Head of the Modern Orthodox Seminary Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, which promotes a more open and inclusive orthodoxy. He too has written for The Forward, Tablet, and the New York Times, and hosted highly popular Torah podcasts, including the one that was the genesis of the book we'll be discussing tonight. Because together, the two of you have spent many, many hours over the last few years discussing what the Torah teaches about loving the stranger, the miracle of Jewish survival, and the complex relationship between humans and God. Those conversations were scripted into a podcast published by Tablet called Parsha in Progress. And now, for those who are print inclined, they are newly edited and collected in a volume called It Takes Two to Torah. I've got mine right here. This is what it looks like. And so we are so delighted to welcome you here, to learn from you, and to be brought into your multi-year dialogue. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.
So the first question I'm gonna ask is, how did you guys meet?
Should I start, Dov?
Please.
Yes, I'm the pushier one of the two of us. You're going to learn that. No, we interrupt each other, and feel free to interrupt me, Dov. Basically, Dov and I met at a Jewish conference, and it's very apropos because it was convened by the Jewish Week, which is convening this conversation. And it was actually called The Conversation, which is the perfect actual title for it, because that's what we were doing. We were talking. There were about 40 of us invited. It was just a wonderful opportunity to go to Baltimore for 3 days and talk about what was on our minds. So it was journalists and clergy and not-for-profit heads and writers and thinkers and artists. And they really were inviting us to kind of say, what was keeping you up at night? What are the Jewish issues that you want to talk about with no tape recorders, essentially off the record? And Dov and I just kept landing in the same breakout sessions. And I'm a little bit of a rabbi groupie. Some of you who have read my work know that I'm just always, my teachers are everywhere. And when I find a great one, I kind of glom on and kind of want to bat around ideas with them. And Dov was, really, we were oil and water in terms of kind of where we come from, our Jewish backgrounds, our Jewish educations, and our Jewish practice. But we found common ground in just ideas and conversation and debate. And we struck up a friendship that lasted for many, many years. And when I was working on my second book, which was about the Jewish holidays, I hope some of you have seen it. And if you haven't, it's still available on Amazon. But it was basically, I did the deep dive. I called it Extreme Sport Judaism. And I really wanted to understand every single notch in the belt of a Jewish life, of a Jewish calendar, the scaffolding of a Jewish year. So I interviewed over 60 rabbis and scholars about everything from Elul, which I didn't realize we have to atone before we atone for 30 days, all the way till where we are right now, obviously, finishing Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah and reading the Torah again. And when I was finishing that book, I really wanted to make sure that the Judaism was correct. So in addition to Dov and I exchanging ideas over the years, I asked him to basically vet that book because he's memorized the Torah, memorized the Talmud, really knows Jewish law. He's really a acclaimed authority in the modern Orthodox world. And he did that for me so generously. And that started a chevruta of a certain kind. And then conversely, when he was writing an op-ed for the New York Times or something else he was working on, he would seek my guidance. And finally, he said, we should bring our chevruta kind of out loud. We should talk Torah out loud in real time over 2 years and invite people in. So it wasn't just about us being experts. And certainly I am the last thing I'll call myself as an expert, but to invite people into a conversation we were having across denominational lines in a kind of pluralistic snapshot of how this extraordinary book can bind a people and bind a friendship. And that's what we did for the podcast, which is now a book. And I'll hand it over to Dov. Did I leave anything out? I didn't take a breath.
Exactly. Oh my God, this is the old joke about like, why didn't you say it? Well, I didn't want to interrupt. So anyway, yeah, I mean, the podcast went for 2 years and we did every other week. And, we thought we had a wonderful time doing it and people told us how much they enjoyed it. And it felt like the project was over, but we kept on hearing from people, I think as Abby just said, how much they enjoyed it, but they couldn't find it all in one place and they would just like to be able to access it. Finally, it was Abby's idea to say, let's just get this transcribed and then work on it and turn this into a book, which is what we did. And that was a process that began, I would say, about a year and a half ago. And what we were really surprised at was to see how well it translated to the page, because what makes this book different, I would say, than other Parsha books is that this is not exposition, it's not dense paragraphs, it's really content rich, but it's highly engaging. It's two different voices listening, pushing, probing, exploring. People have told us how much they feel pulled in by the warmth and the dialogue, like that they want to argue back with us as they're reading the book, which was so refreshing and wonderful to hear, because it couldn't be assumed that what works on a podcast is going to work on a book. But it really does. The book is now it's 54 chapters, one chapter per parsha. It's a short, an easy ask, 3, 4, 5 pages of parsha. So you can really have it as your guide as you're going through. You mentioned the genesis of this. Well, we're about to start with Genesis, as you know, this coming Shabbat, to really just have it be your guide throughout the coming year, reading just a few pages each week as we go through the Parsha again.
There's the plug, folks. If you order it now, you can have it in time for Parshat Breshit. Amazon delivers fast. Okay, so I have a question about this audience, this large audience that you are engaging with. Who did you think would be your audience, and who is your audience? Is it about what you expected, or have you been surprised by who your interlocutors are in this larger discussion?
Dov, you want to start?
Yeah, I think that, they're the audiences of the people that we've been bringing the book to in our book tour, and that's been, I think, really a whole new range of experiences for me, exciting for me, because I have not, I've spent decades in the study hall, in the Beit Midrash, in front of a Talmud, but pretty much exclusively in Orthodox spaces. Every now and then I get out to something like The Conversation, and I, of course, have been occasionally, at other synagogues, but this has been an opportunity to be in a range of spaces, some Orthodox, but a lot conservative, Reform, and to me, that's been really opening up new experiences and inspiring, as when we've been doing presentations in these spaces, to hear how deeply people appreciate serious, deep, rich Torah when it's made accessible and it speaks and is relevant to their lives. So that I think is like one major audience. But the
I
other
would just interject there
Yeah.
that one of the things that was a surprise to me. I thought that after spending so much time with Dov, I knew everything about him. But we were being interviewed actually by the Forward before, just when our book was about to come out, and she said, "So you're going to all these reform shuls, Dov, and some of them you're doing on Shabbat." And he sort of stopped her and said, "Well, do you have to print that I'm going to these reform shuls on Shabbat?" And I said, "Dov, what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, it's not that I've gone to reform shuls, but I've never spent Shabbat in a non-Orthodox shul. And in the Orthodox community, where you daven on a Friday night is kind of who you are." And I just thought, even if we can argue about whether or not that offends me, because I felt like there was almost like a shame in coming over to my world. I thought I also just admired that there was this sense that every time that we forget our differences, and despite how we've become kind of close as friends, there are just these chasms between us in terms of, even as we travel, Dov's food versus my food, and the way he can travel and where he can stay, and all of these things, is that we are two very different Jews kind of taking this journey together. And this is the book, I don't have to tell anyone on this call, that has been the glue of a people for so long. But we sometimes forget how coming at it from different places with different lifestyles makes the challenges, even just the practicality of showing up somewhere and talking about it. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Dov.
No, I appreciate that point. And, it had nothing to do with any statement about Reform Judaism, but it does have to do with the degree to which, look, as a country, in the Jewish community more broadly, so many things are about identity markers, identity politics. And even though I had absolutely no hesitation in this whole enterprise, with Abby and me about talking to somebody quite different from me and engaging in Torah. All of a sudden, I surprised myself by realizing, like, oh, people are going to say an Orthodox rabbi Shabbat in a Reform synagogue speaking there. Well, you can't really be an Orthodox rabbi if you're speaking in a Reform synagogue. And it had nothing to do with, with halacha. We were very careful about all the halachic issues. And then, so it was, something that I sort of didn't realize was a sensitive point, that, until it sort of was confronted me. And then I decided I really just have to own it. Okay, let people have their issues. This now is a time when we have to be focusing on Avat Yisrael, love of the Jewish people, bringing us together, not getting caught up in these politics and in these markers and in all of those taboos, and really doing what we need to be bringing us together. So that it's been quite a transformative experience just going on this tour.
Lovely. And I see Abigail has trained you to translate all your Hebrew terms. I heard that on the podcast. So I don't have to.
I will still make that mistake a dozen times during this interview. Trust me, during this discussion.
All right, I want to get into the substance of Torah and past the biographical stuff, but just real briefly, if you can do it briefly. I know that's hard, but real briefly, like biographically, for people who don't know, Abigail, on the cover, you identify yourself as Reform. Dov, you identify yourself as Orthodox. But there is a wide spectrum, and people also have moved in their lives. Give us a brief biographical sketch of yourselves as Jews.
Okay, we'll do it really fast, because obviously it's these are longer stories. But I would just say that I was raised with home-based Judaism, which means I didn't belong to a synagogue. We went twice a year, first to Stephen Wise, then to B'nai Jeshurun. For those who know, that will sort of anchor me in certain ways. But honestly, it was a little bit like catch as catch can. My mom was Abigail Pogrebin, some of you may know, had kind of a seminal experience when she was young and walked away from her very conservative, observant life for a number of years. And my sister and brother and I kind of fell through the cracks. So we didn't get a formal Jewish education. I was not a bat mitzvah, and it began to bother me. So I started to study when I was writing my first book about famous Jews, Stars of David. I thought I needed to know more. I started to study Torah. That led to me becoming bat mitzvah at 40 and becoming a little bit of a learning addict, where I was auditing classes at JTS and studying at Hadar and going online and at seminars and reading books. It's sort of like the more I learned, the more I wanted to know. And my first book, Stars of David, led to being at a lot of these conferences and meeting a lot of these rabbis and sort of being in the world of reporting on the Jewish story in a way that animated me. But it bothered me that I didn't know the holidays. So I took that dive into the holidays and I interviewed over 60 rabbis for that. And what was missing still, I felt like, was frankly the book, again, that you can't and should never avoid, because it anchors every week of Jewish life, and that's the Torah. And so when Dov had the idea that we do the podcast, I was all in. But I would say that I am someone who belongs to a synagogue now. I joined Central Synagogue in 2006. It has become my spiritual home, a home for my family. But in the scheme of my life, it's fairly recent, 15 years that I've been part of a place. I became the president there. I'm very involved there. I love it. But I also travel around and feel like my teachers are everywhere, and that the learning ultimately is where I have the most feeling. Dov, over to you. And I want to just give a shout out to my in-laws who are from Skokie, who are frankly like more grounded Jews than I was, but welcomed me into their Midwestern Jewish life. So I married a Jew from Skokie. We have
a rabbi in Skokie, a couple of rabbis in Skokie from the yeshiva. So I grew up in a modern Orthodox family, and I, at a very young age, took to like the study of Torah, and particularly the study of Talmud, like a fish to water. You know, I was spending 4 or 6 hours a day while I was in high school, just in front of the Talmud, totally intense, diving very, very deep. To the point that, you know, I would, as I would walk home from high school, I would be thinking about all the arguments in the Talmud in my head, and I would keep my eyes closed to sort of really focus. And more than once, I kid you not, more than once I walked into a telephone pole as I was walking home from the yeshiva, which is, I think, a really powerful metaphor for a lot of my life, you know, which had been extremely intensive and deep. And by the time I was in yeshiva in Israel, after high school, I was spending 14 to 16 hours a day in front of the Talmud, really to a point I was like chewing coffee grinds to keep myself up, because I didn't have the time to go make myself a cup of coffee, because it would have meant taking a minute away from Talmud study. But you know, that narrowness, that laser focus, also meant that, you know, my peripheral vision wasn't great, and I really wasn't engaging more broadly in the world and bringing the Torah conversation into the world. So fast forward about 20 years after that, Avi Weiss, 25 years ago, Rabbi Avi Weiss had a vision of starting a new type of a rabbinical school, which became Chovevei Torah, and represents a different orthodoxy, an orthodoxy that's much more open, liberal, inclusive, welcoming of all people. At the time, and even today, it really, the big thing, at least then, was about women, and, you know, what Abigail tells about her mother. 25 years ago, Orthodox feminism was a big thing, women's opportunity to say Kaddish, to play a role in the synagogue, even while there's still clear differences and, you know, distinctions, because it's still Orthodox and mechitza and all of that, but still expanding the role as much as possible. And in many other ways, what I sort of say is it was about building bridges and not building walls, and this type of openness and inclusiveness. And he came to me and wanted me to sort of head the not be the rabbinical head. He would be the president. I would represent the scholarship, and that was an opportunity of a lifetime. And then fast forward about 20 years after that, 5 years ago, he had stepped down from being president, and I had the opportunity of going from the Rosh HaYeshiva, the academic head, to becoming the president of the institution. And, you know, over all of that time, we were producing rabbis who, I think one of the things that really distinguishes them is that they were able to take the Torah, this ancient wisdom and tradition, and translate it into people's lives, translate it into the larger world, bring it out of the Beit Midrash into the world. But so much of my world had always been training those rabbis, but not going out. And I was never doing the translating myself. So I think stepping up to being president was really that shift. And that's when we decided to start doing this podcast, and that brought about the book. And it's really been a life of not having texts, just talking to other texts, but Abby has pushed me to have texts talk to the world. And that's a really major difference.
Thank you both. We have one very small question in the Q&A, and I will pose that to you, which is, when will the Kindle book be available? And while you prepare to answer that question, let me just tell our audience that your questions are invited. Please use the Q&A function. Substantive questions or practical questions like this are welcomed, and we will try to get to them as we can.
Yeah, we love questions. So we hope people will send them in. And the Kindle is apparently like a week away from availability. But we now have a website, and we would love people to go to it. It's called ittakes2totorah.com. Right, Dov?
Yep, yes.
And we will, we're going to post there when the Kindle version is available. Thank you for that reminder.
Okay, so tell me, when do you guys disagree most strongly? Like, when have you, in all of your discussions, because I have listened to much of the podcast, which is, reading the book is fun, but also listening to your voices and your intonations and so forth is fun. When do you struggle to find common ground? When does that happen for you?
In the book, in the Torah, or just in our lives?
In your interpretation of Torah.
Yeah.
We already heard about the hotels and the food and the going to reform shuls on Shabbos and all that stuff.
I mean, I think that just overall, I will start that what I think one of the foundational chasms is that for Dov, everything in the Torah has to ultimately be reconciled as positive. And that however difficult the parsha might be, or the facts of the story might be, however much discomfort I might have, or even he might have, he has to kind of find his way to a good outcome, that he's willing to kind of get in there and argue about it and pick it apart and talk about its difficulties. But he kind of has to get a place where, I mean, this is a sacred document for him. It is sacred for me too. As I said, I would describe myself as a person of faith, and I understand how core this document is, but I feel like I can kind of be more honest about where I'm out, like on something. And I'll just give one quick example. The fact that after the Israelites build the golden calf, they made a big mistake, but they really hadn't been taught very long. They hadn't been free very long. They had just gotten out of Egypt. Like, they've been slaves. They don't necessarily have the tools to know what it is to be a free person, and to know what it is to trust that when Moses says, I'm going up to this mountain and getting God's law, and then I'm going to be right back, that they would trust that. Like, I can sympathize and get inside their doubt. And the fact that they build this idol, which they shouldn't have, the God was completely unforgiving at first. God's instinct was not just anger, but and Moses was angry too. But just the idea that Dov sometimes had to lead me to understand why God's disappointment, I should take that a little more serious, not be so eviscerating or intolerant of God's intolerance. And some people don't realize how many were killed after that mistake. It wasn't just that ultimately they get another shot. Moses does go up, gets the tablets again, but like 3,000, am I right, Dov? 3,000 are killed. That's like, wow, that's a big punishment. A lot of people died for that misstep. And that was a kind of one of those moments where it's not that I'm just hopefully not like someone stamping their foot and saying, I don't like this. This seems unfair. But Dov would have to lead me to kind of understanding why a people is taking shape, leadership is taking shape, and I have to see it a little bit differently. I don't know if Dov, you want to jump in on that.
Well, yeah, I would say that, sometimes I myself would acknowledge that I didn't have a sufficient answer, but I would end by saying I really would rather leave this as a question than either give an answer that I don't feel is sufficient, or to say I feel this is, or to pass judgment on the text, because I didn't feel that I was in a position to say this is wrong. The best I could come to is sort of saying, I don't understand this. I agree with you. This seems overly cruel. It doesn't make sense. I'm just going to leave that as a question. And I don't think Abby was satisfied with that, but that was as far as I could allow myself to go, and sort of in the world I inhabit, in the Orthodox world, I think that I'm quite open-minded and willing to raise issues that other people wouldn't raise. Like other people would say it's heretical to even say that you find that problematic. Or another area we discussed was the whole ritual of the sota, where the husband does this demeaning ritual, regarding a wife he suspects of adultery, that most people in the Orthodox community would say, you can't question that, that's in the Torah. And I would actually say, no, you can actually say, look, it's very difficult to understand. How is this consistent with our understanding of morality? But so I maybe, would give myself a pat on the back that I'm willing to raise those issues. But I will only go so far. I will either come up with an answer that I feel works for me, and then Abby will tell me why it doesn't work for her or from a different perspective, or leave it as a question, and not ultimately pass judgment on the text. I remember in particular one exchange way at the beginning, I think in Genesis, in Breshit, which had to do with, Adam and Eve and so on. And Abby asked me a question of, how do I deal with this text, with this sexist text? And I said, I'm not going to call it sexist. I would say, how do I deal with the text that I experience as sexist, rather than the sexist text? And Abby said, well, Dov, that's very solipsistic. It's not all about you. But I needed to frame it that way, not because it was all about me, but because I couldn't put myself in a position to be passing judgment. I could talk about my experience of it, and that was a way I had to negotiate that issue.
Can I just give one other example? I'll just be very quickly. There's the moment that I think so many people know, which is Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land. And it just was so shattering for me to really get inside his disappointment and frankly what I felt was like the injustice of that. After he did everything he was told, he was picked when he didn't ask for the job. God says, go free your people, go confront Pharaoh. He's like, I don't want to do this. God says, you're going to do it. I'm going to give you Aaron to support you. You're going to do this. Then he leads the people out, not easy. And they're pretty ungrateful. And they're pretty kvetchy, and they don't like the food, and they don't like the desert, and they don't trust that they're ever going to get to the promised land. There's ever going to be milk and honey, and then obviously they don't trust Moses when he goes up to get the law. There's so many ways in which it was kind of thankless, but he continues and he advocates for them. And when they screw up, he is their defender and makes sure that, he is essentially, the lawyer for the Israelites when God is done with them. He's done everything right. And still, he is denied this denouement, this moment of that I feel like he's earned. And it's so powerful to read those words in the parsha in Deuteronomy. I think it's Hukat, and then there's another parsha where you just have to get inside the fact that he's realizing he's going to die without ever tasting it, without ever seeing it. I couldn't help but it echoes the Martin Luther King speech, which obviously he drew, MLK Jr. from Deuteronomy. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I have seen the promised land. And he didn't get to see it. And it's just heartbreaking. And so just to say to Dov, just explain this to me. How does this square? And Dov, maybe you want to say what you explained, but it was very moving to me, Dov's explanation, and it changed my thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I was very moved by how personally and emotionally Abby was responding to this. I had heard this story so many times, so I could not get emotionally worked up about Moses and his faith. And also, where I come from, I mean, everything is about Moses. It's Moses Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, the Torah of Moses. Like the whole tradition it's more associated with him sometimes than with God. So the fact that Abby was
so you're saying like he got his due. He got his due.
My God, but Abby felt him as a human being, not as this larger than life figure, and was so identifying with him on the human level, was very, very moving to me, and made me realize that was a piece that I was not allowing myself or not going, where I was not reacting to that element. But my answer, which might be more satisfying intellectually, but doesn't respond to the pathos of the moment, was that sometimes leaders have to step aside, and that, the whole sin with the rock, what was so terrible? He hit the rock. And I wanted to see that not as a sin and a punishment, but as a indication that he was still stuck in his old ways, and he still wanted to beat people over the head, and a top-down leadership. And that might be good for slaves, but that's not what an empowered, new, young population needs for their leader. And that was necessary, even though it might have been unjust for Moses the man.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a question that engages with a question that came in here, and I think it dovetails nicely with what you're saying. One of our participants says, I love these conversations. Have you also considered adding Kabbalah in your evaluation of text? Because of course, in the journey to find meaning in these texts, you guys draw on scholarship and rabbinic interpretation, right? And lots of, and all kinds of things. And that's part of how Jews over the years have solved their anxieties about this text when it's uncomfortable for them, is with new interpretations. So anyone move to talk about Kabbalah?
I mean, it's such a great point. I have actually dipped a toe into learning it, and it is so overwhelmingly difficult and complicated. I interviewed Daniel Matt. Whoever's asking the question may know he's one of the scholar of scholars when it comes to the Zohar. It's just so hard for me. It doesn't mean that eventually we shouldn't take it on. And I don't know, Dov, how much that's been your expertise, but it does feel to me, it's such a smart idea, and maybe for someone not me, it's so rich, but it feels like its own language, and it's so vast and it's so complicated. And I feel like I barely learned this one, and I still have to learn Hebrew better because I read it at a glacial pace. So it does feel to me like a bridge I haven't had the courage to cross. Dov, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say, Abby, that sometimes you're saying how you're always finding out new things about me. I did not know this about you, that you had actually dipped your toe into Kabbalah. But I fully agree with your assessment. It's really a language unto itself, and it's valuable for studying Kabbalah, but not for a deeper, I feel, understanding of the text as we as moderns understand it. Everything becomes a symbol of something else, not the story of the thing itself. I will say that sometimes what did happen is that Abby would share an interpretation that she had read, which I thought was valid on its own terms, but I was not prepared to buy as what the text was actually saying. Particularly, I think this came up with the story of the Akedah, right in the beginning of we'll be reading it in like a month. And that's such a difficult story for moderns here, because you believe that you hear God say something.
Well, you have to tell, Joe, just make sure people understand which story you mean.
This is why Abby is.
It's the binding of Isaac, everybody.
I know. Thank you. So the binding of Isaac, which God speaks to Abraham and says, take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and bring him as an offering to me on the place where I will show you. And then Abraham goes and he travels with Isaac, and he binds him to the altar, and he's about to take the knife and slaughter Isaac. And the angel calls out from heaven and says, stop, don't do that. And Abraham offers up a ram instead. We just had Rosh Hashanah. For many, the symbolism of the horn of the shofar, the ram's horn, is to evoke that moment. And there the text says, because you have feared me and you listened to my voice and you did not withhold your son from me, I will surely bless you, and you will be very prosperous. And for many modern people read this and say, Abraham should not have listened to God. God tells you to commit murder to an innocent. You shouldn't listen, and would like to read the story that Abraham failed the test by actually being prepared to go through with it. And so Abby sort of proffered this in our learning of this story. And I said, look, I deeply appreciate what is motivating that interpretation, and where that is coming from. But I'm not prepared to say that that's what's going on in the text, because the text ends with the angel saying, because you listened to me and didn't hold your son back from me. So I think there are times where we can value a reading on its own terms and what it's trying to do. But our conversation was always getting back to, but what is the text telling us?
Thank you. So I'm going to push you on that one a little bit, Dov. What is the text telling us? Where does that meaning inhere in the text? Are you looking for original intention, something that's consistent with everything else in Torah? What do you mean by that?
Wow, yeah, that's a pretty big meta question. I do not as you know, the rabbis speak about many, many layers of text: pshat, remez, drasha. So the simple meaning, the hints, all these different layers. Some are valuable, like I said, on their own terms, like midrash, not because I believe it's what's in the text. I don't know if original intention is something that we're actually ever able to really get at. To me, it seems like a like very elusive. But I do want it to feel that it works. Like I could read the text and say that is an explanation that does not do violence to the way the story is being told. That is consistent. If we imagine this not as a divine text, which I of course believe it is a divine text, but we imagine this as just a simple story, is like, and we had no idea about the original intent or the historical context, we would say, does it fit the words? And I think that's really the question that I want to ask myself: is does it fit the words? And is it, if it's something, I'm very open to creative reads, but but if I feel they're doing violence to the language, then I won't accept it. At least not as the meaning of the text.
I would just add one quick thing about the Akedah, the Binding of Isaac, which turned my head, because it's just such a hard story for any parent to imagine ever saying yes to a command like that, to take your child and be ready to sacrifice him. But and I actually just have this pulled up because it moves me every time. When I was struggling with it, Dov said, and this was obviously, we talked about this parsha pre-October 7th. It has such a different overlay now. Dov said, can you imagine, he said, if you don't have anything you're prepared to die for, then you don't have anything you're prepared to live for. Like, if there's not something you're willing to sacrifice, what is your life about? And that doesn't mean you're willing to sacrifice your child, but just that, have you ever thought of something where the stakes were so high that you would give up something really big? And then watching the post-October 7th world, where all of these Israeli families and parents have said goodbye to their kids, essentially, as they go and defend Israel, there is a sense of sacrifice there, that I'm willing to make this sacrifice, that I am saying and kissing and hugging you goodbye, believing that what you're doing is worth it. I will share it because Dov has allowed it. He's given me permission because he's talked about it publicly, that he lost his nephew 7 months ago who was serving, and just this story, it's one of those moments where something I used to reject and say, I can't even go there, now is something I actually see very differently.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Dov, I'm sorry for your family's loss.
Thank you.
I want to invite those people who have their hands up. The format here is I'm gonna read questions from the chat. So if you could just type those in for me, I would appreciate that. All right, so this is I think, I want to formulate this question clearly. I think that a lot of your conversation, my senses, comes from a certain friction that is created when values we hold aren't apparent in the text. When, at least on first read, the text isn't reflecting back to us our values. And so here is my big question about reading this text for you. Which comes first? Do we get our values from the world and then interpret the text to align with them? Or is the Torah there to teach me values and how to be in the world? Directionally, how do you think it's working for you? And is it the same for both of you, or is it different? And is that where some of your friction and light come from?
I'm letting Dov go first. Why are you laughing,
You're
Dov?
asking all these very big literary questions, like what's the meaning of the text? Where do our values come from? Look, we cannot escape our situatedness, our background, our upbringing, our worldview, our situatedness, no matter how objective we want to be, right? That is certainly one of the teachings of postmodernism, that we have to sort of like recognize that. At the same time, I absolutely do not believe in that our goal in engaging the Torah text is about finding affirmation of the values that we already hold. I don't think that that's a way of doing real learning at all. Real learning comes through being challenged and asking yourself, wow, that seems to be very different. And before I dismiss it or try to squeeze it into, my value, maybe I should ask myself, what is that approach that maybe I have not opened myself to? The Torah believes much, has a lot, gives a lot of weight to communitarian values, the value of community, and it's not all about individual liberty and self-actualization. And that sometimes means that individuals don't have the types of freedoms that they have in society, right? So I say, well, and am I just going to say that's wrong? Or I'm going to say maybe I take my values that are so much about individualism too much for granted and too much as an absolute good. Maybe those are the ones that need to be challenged. So I think that it's really about allowing yourself to be in conversation with the text. And at the same time, we can't escape the fact that we are going to interpret things through our own lens. Like the Torah has, slavery is throughout in the Torah. And there are mitzvot about, commandments about free your slaves after 7 years and all of that. And I read that, and to me, it's obvious that what the Torah is saying is, we should not have slaves at all. That's an institution that is horrific. You were slaves in Egypt. You should get rid of that institution. And we're going to put you on the right path to get rid of it by weaning you off it and instituting these laws. And some people will say, you're just reading that because you're influenced by Western liberal perspectives on the world. The Torah is totally fine with slavery as long as you have these parameters, right? So in the end, even what I genuinely believe is a value of the text, I can't escape that it's coming through my own lens, and that's true about anybody who reads it and any attempt at objective reading.
You want me to answer?
Okay, so Dov goes for column A and column B. It's a conversation between the two. Abby, do you agree?
Well, first of all, I think it's such a great question, and no one has asked us this, so I'm really wholly unprepared and kind of panicking.
Good, then we'll get a candid response.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I mean, you're sort of calling out. I think that more than Dov, I start with my values. And I think that part of what I was pushed to do was to say, you know what, Abby, you have, in a way, I like to think of them as principles, but sometimes they're prejudice. And it's not going to be that simple. And Dov's not going to let it be that simple, and neither is the Torah. But I would also say that this is where there's so many Jews I know, and I was one of them, who always talk about Jewish values and have no idea where they're located. Like if you ask them to say, can you point one out? And it's just part of the way we were raised. Jewish values, where are they? And again, I pull this up just because for today, because it's really one of my favorites. And it's this part in Deuteronomy 15:7, which says, if there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the need. Like that is really clear and really challenging if we're going to live it. Like I know there's people needy around me. I live in New York City. The minute I walk out the door, there is someone needy in front of me. And when I think about that now, it's not just like, oh, there's this value over there. It's kind of, I guess, it's a roundabout way of saying that it pushes me to say, what would it mean to have this book actually obligate you a little more rigorously than you allow it to? And that's kind of where this journey took me, is knowing now where these values are located. How seriously do I want to take them for my life?
I have to share something, if you'll allow me, which is last night we were speaking at a synagogue, and as we were getting ready to go home, the person who organized the event said, oh, like I left my check for that I have to give to the driver. And Abby thought like he was going to take care of it the next day. And I said, no, you can't do that. It's in the Torah. You got to pay the person on time.
So, we were in Roslyn, Long Island.
Good. Okay. So, let me give you a break from the heavy. We'll go from the sublime to the ridiculous. We have an audience question. When is the Torah ever funny? When's it funny?
Whoa.
Oh, is the Torah funny? Wow. The Talmud is pretty funny sometimes. Wow, I don't think.
You know what I think is a little funny? I think that Joseph is a little ridiculous. That's what I would say. Like his coat and he wore makeup. And he just was like, I think he was pretty full of himself. So I think there's a little bit of a humor about the fact that he was favored and kind of leaned into that favoritism in a way where I could imagine someone spoofing him a little bit, like a bit of a, I don't know if fop is politically correct anymore. Go ahead, Dov. That's where I would find a little humor.
Well, I don't know about the Torah in terms of the 5 books of Moses, but I do think what we just read on Yom Kippur and the story about Jonah, where it says that the city of Nineveh repented and they put on sackcloths, the people and the animals, and the animals were wearing sackcloths and ashes. And then you had that God wanted to teach Jonah a lesson, and he made this gourd grow, and the worm ate it, and Jonah got furiously mad at it. And then it you know, it seems like it's like a theater of the absurd. And then the last verse of the book of Jonah is God says, "How shall I not have compassion on Nineveh, a city of more than 600,000 people? I've got the number, and many animals."
So glad that Dov is laughing so hard. I'm not sure everybody else is.
Well, it's a little absurd in the context.
No, it's just esoteric, but that's your expertise.
Speaking of funny, even if the Torah, we have to look hard for funny spots, other books like Esther are sort of out loud, obviously funny in our Jewish text. And so I want to share now that one of our audience members is suggesting that you continue your project into Nevi'im and Ketuvim, which of course are the next 2/3 of the Hebrew Bible, the writings of the prophets, and then the scrolls and other miscellaneous writings at the back of the book. Any plans for that?
Nice idea. All these people with these ideas should do it themselves. But I love that idea. It's just, again, Dov kind of lives and breathes this because he's been studying Torah from the womb. So every time I take something on, and I'm not going to play the violins for myself, I approach it as a journalist, and it takes a lot of preparation. And I so love that I get to ask Dov anything I want to ask, and he's kind of memorized these texts. But anything that is sort of a future project, I go in with so much humility about what I don't know and need to learn. So I think I would just need a lot of runway.
Okay, something to think about. No promises, audience, for a continuation of the book and the podcast. Let's give you a little the kind of question you might ask each other that you don't ask in the book or in the podcast, or at least not that I remember, that comes also from an audience member, which is this. We're going back to this person. I think is inspired by the conversation about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, when God calls upon Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son. And this person asks, so how come Abraham famously argued against God to not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but then didn't argue when God said, now I want you to offer up your son as a burnt offering?
Go, Dov.
Well,
let's see it in action.
Yeah, no. That is an excellent question, and others have asked it as well. Some would sort of like to, somebody suggested, well, maybe he learned his lesson from the story of Isaac, and then he argued with Sodom and Gomorrah, but that doesn't work chronologically because the Sodom and Gomorrah story came first. At some level, I think it might be that it's easier to argue on behalf of somebody else when then you're sort of arguing for what's right and not because you have a vested interest. Whereas if Abraham would have argued with God about the justice of offering up Isaac, then it's in his own mind. How does he know that he's doing it because he really feels it's wrong? And how does he know he's not doing it because he doesn't want to make the ultimate sacrifice that God is asking him for? So I think at some level it was easier for him, like to challenge God when he knew that he was not trying to save himself from something that was impossibly difficult. That's about as best as I can come up with. Also, probably he did understand that this was a test, whereas the Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't a test. And if he wasn't being tested, and it was just a question of how was God acting justly, again, it's different than when you know that you're being tested.
You think Abraham knew he was being tested?
I don't think there's any other way of understanding, like trying to get into his head, which is now all speculation, but like it was completely illogical. Besides, it's life of an innocent and it's a murder and so on. God had said, told him that he was going to give him a son. This was a son that was promised for, they had waited all his life for, that he said this would be, the generations, the Jewish nation. And without any reason, he just said, offer him up as a sacrifice. So I can't imagine how Abraham would have understood that anything else than God is trying to test my faith.
Does that, sorry, Abby, I'm jumping into your role here. Does that not dilute the faith that Abraham displayed? If he knows it's just a test?
Are you asking me or Abby?
I'm asking you. Yeah.
Well, you might know it's a test, but that doesn't mean you know that God is going to pull back at the last minute, right? So it is, God wants to, if you knew, oh, it's only a test and it's not going to be real, that would dilute the faith. But if it's, look, Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Danish philosopher, wrote the book called Fear and Trembling, which is all about grappling with the morality of the Akedah and how can we believe what happens when faith confronts morality. And he has a beautiful, and how could Abraham have done it knowing that it was an act of murder that God was asking him to do? And I find that the most powerful part of that was he said, Abraham was prepared to do it, and he was going to do it. And at the same time, he believed that it would never actually happen. And he was able to hold both of those contradictory beliefs at the same time. His belief in God and what God had promised and what God would want from him. I can't believe in the end this will actually happen, but I'm going to do it if God demands it of me. And so I think that's, to me, the best way of getting inside Abraham's head.
So in the end, you're a Kierkegaardian.
In this regard.
We're going to lose our audience.
All right,
we're getting way too obscure.
We won't, okay, Abby, go ahead. Let me let you take it from here.
No, I think you've raised really great questions, Rachel, and I struggle with this a lot. And I feel like there are many times in the Torah where Dov explained to me that ultimately a test was meant to be passed. And he mentioned the Sota ritual where this woman is humiliated and she's basically tested, given this disgusting thing to drink. And if her belly distends, then she's guilty of adultery. But Dov would say, like, the rabbis they read it so that they knew that she would never fail that test. And there's a few times where that was the case. And I feel like this is one of them where somehow, maybe intuitively, Abraham knew that Isaac was never going, that knife was never going to touch him. And I hope that that's the case, because otherwise it's just too hard a story to square. That's the way that I can only reconcile this horrific moment.
All right, we have.
And if you'll allow me, I do want to say one.
Wait, we have another question, Dov.
No, I'm not going to read them all because people are also struggling with this story and trying to for themselves.
So I just need to share
that your audience is jumping in on this conversation with you.
Okay.
You can't take the time to look at the comments.
But I do want to respond to a comment on it because I do want to share what ultimately I think for me is how I deal with the story in the end, which is somebody said maybe God was trying to say something about child sacrifice and about human sacrifice. And I think the question is, what is the message of the story? Is the message the beginning of the story or the end of the story? If the message is the beginning of the story, it's like, okay, even when God asks you to take your son as a sacrifice, you're supposed to listen to him. I don't believe that's the message. I believe the message is the end. The message is that ultimately God will never ask you to do this. That if you think God is asking you to do this, you have to listen to that smaller voice, that angel, it's not God, but you have to be ready to hear that other voice and realize that that is not what God wants and God will never ask you to do this. And that's what I actually think is the message of the story.
All right, we'll leave it there on the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. We have, I think, time for me to give you guys a hard time about one more thing, and it's this. In one of your moments of repartee, I think somewhere in the middle of the book of Leviticus, I think it's Parshat Trumah, things are getting pretty real and pretty graphic. We've got menstrual purity, we've got spilled semen, and at one point you kind of jokingly say to each other, I don't know if we're ready to discuss this. And it's a funny moment, and you turn to discuss something else. But here's my question. Are there things that still feel hard to discuss? What's like the hardest thing in Torah to discuss?
Wow.
Good question. I mean, I certainly didn't love talking about the emissions with Dov, and even look, we were talking on a serious note. We did this podcast between 2018 and 2020, which were extremely, there were years of great upheaval and turbulence in this country. Not that we're not in a lot of turbulence right now. And the COVID pandemic was going on. We were doing this in person, and we had to stop doing it in person. But more importantly, all of the parshiot about disease and contagion and things on your skin and leprosy or not leprosy and expelling someone from the community. Like, I used to see, you used to just feel sorry for the bar bat mitzvah who got this parsha, these parshas, but suddenly it was so alive and almost prescient. Like, look at how these issues were still animated in the ancient world. And we were literally deciding, can I see my mother-in-law? Can I hug my sister-in-law? Can I actually come home? Or do I have to put my kid into to a hotel? These were all things that suddenly were alive. And that's just one example of where, post October 7th, I feel like this entire Torah is a new document. It's just a new document, but it's also an old document. It speaks to us in every moment. That's not a cliche or a Hallmark card. I think it's the reason why it's alive in every generation and every week and every year of our lives. And so that's what I don't love talking about the things I don't want to talk about, but I also feel like sometimes they become extremely relevant.
Yeah. I guess I would add that I don't think there's anything in the Torah that I would hesitate to speak about, but what's really difficult is when it speaks to, what was amazing about the conversation is, that Abby was constantly saying, okay, what does this have to do with my life? What does this have to do with what's going on in the world? And when the Torah is brought into a conversation of something that is such something that can be potentially explosive and triggering, like what's happening now, even within the Jewish community around post-October 7th. And that's really challenging because people can use Torah text to defend the most extremist right-wing positions, the most extremist left-wing positions. And that gets to your question, Rachel, about like, are you coming with your values? Are you actually learning your values from the text? Where is it the devil quoting scriptures? Where is it just trying to attack somebody with the text? So I think that's when it's really, really difficult, not the text itself, but brought into issues that just people cannot have a calm, dispassionate conversation about.
Okay, folks, use the Torah responsibly. We, I think, are going to have to leave it there because we are at the top of the hour again. Abby and Dov, thank you so much.
Thank you
for these conversations, for allowing me to prod you, and for bringing your conversation to the larger community, first as a podcast and now as a book. I also want to thank my colleagues at the New York Jewish Week and our parent company, 70 Faces Media, for producing this event, and of course our partners in the Folio series, UJA-Federation of New York, specifically Graham Cannon, Susan Kahn, and Lori Kalinsky. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please look out for the next in this book Folio series. On Wednesday, November 13th at 6 p.m., literary powerhouse Zibby Owens takes on anti-Semitism in her new anthology on being Jewish now. We hope we will see you then. And until then, Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. We have a little more to go. And wishing everybody a good year and week. Thank you, everybody, for this conversation.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for coming.